Hello everyone, I'm Ben Guyver, Senior Creative Relations with Dolby Laboratories, and welcome to this month's Dolby Atmos Music Community Session, where we're featuring an exciting new tool for Dolby Atmos music creation, the Dolby Atmos Album Assembler. I'll be joined by Dolby Senior Product Manager of Content Solutions, Jordan Glasgow, and Andrew Mendelson, who is the Owner and Chief Mastering Engineer of Georgetown Masters in Nashville, for an overview of the Dolby Atmos Album Assembler, which is a very cool standalone application that's used with the renderer to master Dolby Atmos music content in the ADM B-Wave format. So the Album Assembler lets you import your ADMs and then master each clip. You can also import the corresponding stereo master for each of your Dolby Atmos masters and then refer to the respective reference clip while mastering the Dolby Atmos clip. So Jordan and Andrew will deep dive into this and answer all of your questions in just a few minutes. Of course, you can submit your questions in the question menu here or email them to musicwebinars@dolby.com. Before we get into that, though, I wanted to share a couple of new features and updates that you can find on the Dolby YouTube channel and at our Dolby Pro site, which is professional.dolby.com. So first of all, we've been dropping exclusive video content from this year's NAMM show in Anaheim, which took place in June as part of our Hear from the Masters series, which you're probably familiar with. But we had some really great conversations over the weekend at NAMM with educators, mix engineers, mastering engineers, folks from across the creative community, talking with experts like Michael Romanowski, Bob Clearmountain, Steve Genowick, Natalia Schlesinger, and Robin Rumors. Folks like Nick Reeves, Jay Clark, Karma Auger, and Erica Bell, Mert Ashen, Chuck Ainsley, Jeff Huskins, and Dale Becker. Tons of great folks. It was so great to see everyone in person. I met a lot of you who I've been talking to over video for the past few years. I didn't have a chance to meet in person yet, so it was really nice and special that we could all be together. And thank you for everyone who came through and said hello. But head over to the Dolby YouTube channel to get a look at some of the action from our booth on the show floor in our recap video. And like I said, we're dropping exclusive long-form versions of some of these conversations too over the next couple of weeks. So the first of those is an in-depth interview with Capitol Studios mix engineer Nick Reeves, which is hosted by Jordan Glasgow from Dolby, who'll be joining me here in a second to talk through the Album Assembler, where he and Nick talk through his Atmos workflows, his experience with translation from speakers to headphones, some of his experience with the Dolby Atmos personalized rendering and mastering with the Album Assembler. But I'm sure, as many of you know, Nick is awesome and always has a lot of very interesting things to say. I mean, he has mixed so many different tracks in Atmos from Capitol Studios for a very long time and across all sorts of genres and all sorts of styles. He has amazing insight and it's a really cool conversation. So check out professional.dolby.com or our YouTube channel for that. So following that one, we are dropping an exclusive conversation from NAMM with legendary mastering engineer Bob Clearmountain, where he talks about the unique Dolby Atmos system he put together at his MixThis studios here in California that gives him a perfect and very cool combination of analog control using his SSL over his Atmos workflow, and how he's also used that on mixes he did for artists like Joe Bonamassa, The Band, and A Bad Thing. It is a really cool and interesting conversation, kind of talking about how he harnesses the flexibility of the Atmos system to really get what he wants in a familiar style of control on his board. So in addition to that, there'll be more interesting and very cool interviews coming from NAMM 2022. So watch the Dolby YouTube channel and Pro site for those. Steve Genowick's coming up and a couple more. So excited to share those with you. Also, the latest edition in our Resonance video series features the amazing singer and songwriter and producer, Victoria Monet. So for those of you who know the Resonance series, it's cool. It really showcases the creatives of today who are charting their own path kind of in music creation using Dolby Atmos. And this piece is a really beautiful showcase showing Victoria Monet in studio talking about her new single Coastin', which she just performed live at the BET Awards. And we get to know a little bit more about the person behind the art and how Victoria is harnessing Atmos and connecting with her fans through the technology. It's cool. She shares some stories and experiences that kind of give her a distinct view of the world. She's an amazing artist, and so really stoked to share that with you. Check that out at our Dolby YouTube channel as well. So Dolby also recently hosted She is the Producer Too, which is an immersive production boot camp, which was held over the course of several weeks with the FemHouse crew. FemHouse is a nonprofit organization that's focused on creating and fostering more equitable opportunity for women and non-binary people in the technical areas of music. So Dolby's Maggie Tobin and Dolby Institute's John Scanlon hosted a How to Mix in Dolby Atmos session using Ableton as part of the She is the Producer's Immersive Music Education program. In addition to that, Dolby's Senior Industry Relations Manager, Aaron Venables, sat down for a conversation with FemHouse founder, DJ and producer LP Giobbi to talk about all things Dolby Atmos and how she uses the technology. And following that, Dolby's head of music partnerships, Christine Thomas, had a conversation with legendary mastering engineer Emily Lazar of The Lodge, and We Are Moving the Needle, about the great work her organization is doing to support all women recording industry professionals, audio engineers, and producers, and how they are embracing Dolby Atmos as well. So these organizations all came together in support of She is the Producer. Be sure to check out thisisfemhouse.com and wearemovingtheneedle.org for more information there, and check out the videos on our YouTube channel as well. Also excited to share that Dolby Institute has recently posted 2 Spanish language Dolby Atmos music tutorial videos. First, in the music installation video, mix engineer Luis Del Toro takes you through a complete overview of Dolby Atmos music studio setup in Spanish, system calibration, EQ selection, speaker placement, monitor controllers, all of that is covered. Best practices for gain, EQ, delay settings. Very cool video, really well done. In the second video, they go into a bit more of an in-depth Dolby Atmos music mixing workflow demonstration. Luis goes through sort of the core Dolby Atmos concepts, software setup, but then more in-depth mixing tips and tricks, use of beds and objects, creative use of panning with various instrumentations, how to create your master file in QC. Again, all in Spanish and available at dolby.com/institute. Of course, we have the latest in the Music Creation 101 video series with Luke Argilla and Brian Pennington that we shared, which shows you studio setup and room tuning. That's also on the Dolby Institute page at dolby.com/institute. And of course, the Institute page links out to our professional support site with the entire Dolby Atmos for Music online training, which is available in 5 languages. Our knowledge base with technical info, quick start video guides, FAQs, user forum, all of that's there. You can also grab a download of the Dolby Atmos production suite, the music panner, the binaural settings plugin at professional.dolby.com. There are a ton of resources there for you as well. So in last month's Dolby Atmos Music Community session, we featured a conversation with Nashville mix and mastering duo Webster Tileston and Mike Mansour from their Axis Audio studio, where they do work for the likes of Diplo, Dylan Francis, and Little Big Town, and more. This month, as I mentioned, we're checking out the Dolby Atmos Album Assembler with Jordan Glasgow and Andrew Mendelson. So please submit your questions into the question box below or email to musicwebinars@dolby.com, and we'll jump into that now.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Really excited to be here and to introduce the all-new Dolby Atmos Album Assembler. This is a new music mastering tool for Dolby Atmos designed to help you put the finishing touches on your Dolby Atmos album or songs. It works on Mac OS in conjunction with the Dolby Atmos renderer application. So before we get into the actual workflow, there's a few things that you want to do to get the renderer prepared to work with the Album Assembler. You want to go to the Renderer's Preferences dialog and make sure that your audio input is set to Dolby Audio Bridge. Your output device will typically be your audio interface. LTC input channel needs to match the output channel from the album assembler. Typically 129 is a good choice. If you're using headphones, you probably want to enable headphone only mode. Frame rate should be set to 24 and sample rate 48K. A few other housekeeping things in the renderer: make sure that sync mode is enabled and that the source is set to input. Now over here in the album assembler, we can connect to the renderer by selecting our local renderer here and see that the connection status light turns from red to green. And one other thing, here in the album assembler preferences dialog, you can just check that your LTC output channel is indeed 129. So now let's get started importing some songs. The album assembler works with ADM B-Wave files that can come from any Dolby Atmos compatible application, either from Dolby or the various digital audio workstations that support Dolby Atmos. And we're going to import a song here, and notice in the bottom right it's generating waveforms, but we can get started playing back while that's happening. And the album assembler is sending audio and metadata to the renderer, and you can see the renderer in the background receiving those objects and playing back. In addition to positional information, the album assembler is also keeping track of all of the program level metadata, including trims, downmix, and binaural render mode settings. So any sort of near, mid, far headphone metadata that is in your ADM is coming across to the renderer for playback. And so if we look in the binaural render mode settings window, we see that one, it's being controlled by the album assembler, and two, all of our near, mid, and far information is being transmitted to the renderer. So that's another great thing about the assembler, is that when you have multiple songs loaded, the assembler is keeping track of all of that headphone metadata and appropriately switching it from song 1 to 2 and 3 and so on. We'll get into that more in a minute. So you'll see here that we've imported this ADM file as a single block that you can select and move around on the timeline. The waveform that we're showing is a 5:1 render, and that's just to show you where signal is present. But of course, there's more channels in this ADM than just 5:1. Once selected, you can do some things down here in the clip panel. So you can see the start, end, and duration, and you can do some basic editing functions like trimming the top and tail and adding a fade in or fade out. And this is all done by hovering your mouse over the left and right sides of the clip, either in the middle here for trims or up the top for fades. Crossfades is not supported yet. We get a lot of questions on that, and hopefully something that we can add in a future update. For now, it's just fade in and fade out. Other editing operations, we can zoom in and out on the timeline, either by using the command plus and minus keys or by using the zoom slider here, and of course drag things around. So getting back to this clip panel, we have some pretty exciting processing functions that can help you out with your mastering and assembly process. So you can apply gain overall to every single channel within the ADM file, all object embed channels, either by turning this knob or by typing a value in here. All knobs in the assembler can be reset to their default value by option clicking. We have an EQ, which can be accessed here with this edit button, and you can put it in. And this is an EQ that applies evenly to all channels in your ADM file. So pretty powerful stuff that typically, in a DAW, you would have to strap, in this case, 28 EQs across every single channel. You can do this all here with one fell swoop. And then we have the all-new Atmos Limiter. This is a pretty special limiting algorithm. What it does is it does a render real-time under the hood, uses that to generate a sidechain signal that drives the limiter, and then it's applying limiting evenly on all channels in the ADM for a very musical and transparent result. One thing to note, this is not a brick wall limiter, so as you are using it and messing around, you not only want to be looking at the meters here, but you also want to be looking at the main master output meter at the top here. And if this is clipping, as it is here, you definitely want to lower somewhere in your output gain staging, because that means that one or more channels in your ADM is actually clipping. So, you could lower the output gain. You could also just lower the overall gain to achieve that desired result. Once you've gotten your song sounding the way that you want it, we can analyze loudness here to help you hit your delivery specs. I'm just going to do a short section here to save time. But this loudness analysis is taking all of the gain, EQ, limiting, fades, and of course the duration of the clip into account to give you this calculation that's about to appear here. And one thing to note, if you make any changes to any of those processing settings after you've measured loudness, you will of course need to measure again. So here we're seeing negative 17.4 integrated, so we are close to our negative 18 target, but we need to make a couple of adjustments there. Next up, let's import a couple of additional songs and show arranging them on the timeline. And we also have a stereo reference track below the Atmos track to help us compare the Atmos songs to pre-existing stereo. If there's already a stereo version of the album that we're working on, this can be very handy. So once these Atmos files import here, I'm going to go back under the file menu to import stereo wave. And I'm going to select my stereo versions. They do need to be 48K, so if they're a different sample rate, you'll want to sample rate convert them in a DAW before bringing them in. And now I can toggle between Atmos and stereo using this switch here. I can also use the keyboard shortcut Shift-S to do that in real time. So as I'm playing back, and if we look at the renderer, we can see now that the renderer is just receiving signal on 1 and 2, left and right. And another thing to note here is that when we are monitoring stereo, any BRM settings on channels 1 and 2 are set to off, as you would expect. Now, oftentimes, a mastered stereo album is going to be a lot hotter than the Atmos content, and so we've added a stereo gain level here. So typically you're going to want to turn that down, and that affects globally the entire stereo track so that you can get some kind of gain matching between the Atmos and the stereo. Other things to tell you about: you can save all of your work as a project file. So save project here, we can say webinar number 3, and it saves it as a DA3 file here, as you can see up at the top. As soon as you've made any edits, notice that there's an asterisk there that shows you that something has changed that can be saved. And last couple things to show you: we can copy and paste EQ settings and limiter settings among the various clips. So everything in the assembler is clip-based, meaning that, here I've set my first song to -2, and I have the EQ and limiter in. I'm now going to select the second song, and it has no processing on it so far. And with this guy, I'm going to lower it to 5.2, and I'm only going to put the limiter in. Now, say you have a bunch of songs that were all mixed by the same engineer, and you find an EQ curve that you like, that you want to apply to all. So we can put this to 26, raise this to 3.2, copy that EQ setting, go over to this song, put the EQ in, and paste it over here, and our EQ setting will come across. So that's a pretty handy tip to save some time. And once you have everything sounding the way that you want, the last step is to export your mastered ADM B-Wave file. So go under the File menu to Export ADM B-Wave, name your file, and hit Save. And off you go. You can then deliver your mastered ADM files to your label or streaming service. So that kind of concludes the demo for today. I'll tell you a little bit about how you can get a hold of the Album Assembler. We have a free 90-day trial available at customer.dolby.com. You can also get a similar trial of the Dolby Atmos Production Suite at the same place. And in terms of purchasing, the Album Assembler is being sold for $99 on the Avid store, same place that you can also get a hold of the Dolby Atmos Production Suite. Next up, I'm very excited to introduce our special guest for today. We have Andrew Mendelson and Luke Armentrout from Georgetown Masters. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
So I understand you guys have done upwards of 500 Dolby Atmos albums, some projects including Blake songs, 500 songs. Well, who's counting?
Exactly.
But some projects that you've worked on include Blake Shelton, Kenny Chesney, Cole Swindell, Jimmy Allen, Ingrid Andres, Brian Kelly, and the list goes on. That's a pretty impressive list there. So let's start off with a big picture question. Why is it important to do mastering for Dolby Atmos music? I mean, isn't it just about hitting loudness targets, and can't that be done in the mix project? Why should a mix engineer or producer go to a dedicated mastering engineer?
Well, and I'm glad you phrased it like that, because the term mastering gets misconstrued a lot. Someone has to master the song or the album. Like, someone has to create the master. The question is, do you want to go to a dedicated mastering engineer, someone who specializes in it or not, or do you want to essentially master it yourself? Um, I think it's actually more important in Atmos, in that there's a lot of that what you're looking at when you're mastering is translation, and there's a lot more to think about in terms of how is it going to translate on speakers, how it's going to translate on a sound bar, how it's going to translate using the Dolby binaural codec, Apple Spatial, and yeah, I was just working on a project this week um, that was mixed by two different mix engineers, and there were very different styles. Where one was very stereo with some stuff peppered into various speakers, and one was really much more of an immersive style of mix. And getting those to translate in a one size fits all file format can be difficult. You get it leveled on speakers. Now all of a sudden one of those mix styles is very loud or very quiet on the Dolby binaural, or also you know, the way people use the LFE can really change the translation from song to song. If you're trying to create a cohesive album, especially, it really helps to have somebody focused on how do these songs work together, as opposed to how is this song and this mix constructed.
Yeah, so how did you handle those differences between those different songs on that album, and what tools did you use?
It's I mean, you can do some tricks with EQ and with compression to sort of, and not in a unsimilar way to the way that you work with um, in stereo, to sort of bring those together. And then honestly, it's a lot of back and forth. It's checking it on headphones, checking it in these different places. And I had to do a lot more, say, on this project than on some other projects where it's the same mix engineer throughout, and especially it was the same stereo mix engineer throughout, and they were working from those stems, and so there's consistency built in sometimes, versus other times it's different producer on every song, even in the stereo world. And even if you have the same Atmos mix engineer, there can you know be some translation issues. We've also had issues where we'll be listening to a track, and there'll be like a guitar solo or something, and it's there in, let's say you're listening in binaural, it's there in the headphones. You go to speakers, and it's just not there. And we've had it happen uh, in reverse as well. And sometimes we'll call the mix engineer and tell others like, oh wow, they didn't know that, notice that, because they're focused on other stuff, and there's so much to focus on. Just having that second set of ears can be invaluable. So even on singles, that's kind of where I think we've earned our keep in the singles world, is just the QC and that's another thing with the QC is taking that step off of the mix engineer's plate so that they can move on to mixing their next song. We have a crew here that's built our careers on delivery and managing that delivery with labels and quality control and whatnot. And so we're sort of trying to bring that expertise into the immersive world as well, which sort of, that's why, I felt the assembler was such an important tool. Um, what we've tried to do here is, in our immersive room, we tried to create a very similar feel to the way we work in stereo. I hear a lot of people talk, when they're talking about working in immersive formats, that you have to rethink the way that you make music. And to some degree, that's true, but we have years and years of experience on how to make great sounding music, that I don't think all that experience should get thrown away. And so what we tried to do is bridge that gap a little bit. And when I'm working in the stereo environment, we have what it's called our source computer, which is the song that we're actively EQing, and our destination computer, which is where we assemble, songs that have been um, mastered already, and that's how you can easily compare between them. Um, the assembler essentially takes the place of that destination computer for us. Um, and in our setup, we can easily press a button and hear a level matched untouched mix versus the master we're working on, stereo reference, uh, all running in sync. If we're doing a recall because somebody wants a tweak, we can press another button here, the before and after, um, uh, or be able to hear other projects we've worked on, hear other projects off of Apple Music or off of Amazon, all running through the same D to A's and the same preamps or the same signal chain, because you start introducing, another preamp or another set of speakers. Well, now, there's no consistency there. So it was really important for us to put that investment in up front to design a system to let us work like that. And that would not be possible without the album assembler.
Yeah, I should mention that, you guys have been beta testers for the album assembler for the last many months and have provided us with a lot of invaluable feedback that really made the tool a lot more viable and improved the quality of it. So thank you for that. I know you guys have 2 copies running, right? At least.
Well, yeah, because we're using it in a couple different ways. We're using it, like I said, as our destination, essentially what we define as our destination computer, which is where we essentially assemble, even in the stereo world. We have one dedicated one where we're running it just for reference, because we've worked on a lot of projects before, and sometimes you want to draw back to, okay, what did I do on this? How did this sound? So we have one that's just sort of our, maybe tracks that aren't released and not on Apple Music yet, but we want to reference other songs. And then in the other room, we might have a production person working on QC and delivery, and it can be really handy in that world too. Or if somebody's working in the immersive room and someone else is just trying to do some leveling, or just do some, some mess around with fades, or do some other work. Last time that can be done binaurally without having to use up the immersive room.
Yeah. You talked about QC a couple times. So what sorts of things are you checking for with these ADM files in the assembler?
Obviously, they have to match the stereo file length for delivery. We also, since there's so many moving parts with Atmos, we're always checking, that all of the bed channels are routed to the correct bed channels. All of the objects minus the empty ones are consistent with where they should be. Checking binaural settings, which is a big one as well. Trim and down mix as well. And for a lot of that, we're able to use the assembler for some of it, in terms of like checking the stereo length and things, and making sure that our levels are correct. For some of it, we do end up using the DAW side of things in order to use the binaural settings plugin to just quickly reference the mix and the master to make sure binaural settings are the same, and that things are routed correctly.
Yeah, I know that, you guys have a really, really like established workflow for mastering singles in a DAW in Pro Tools or Nuendo. And, we see the album assembler not as like the best place to do mastering or the end all be all tool, but it's another tool in the arsenal to be used in conjunction with your DAW for maybe finalizing or QC or some of these things that you're talking about. But one of the things that we've spoken about is, doing a whole album in a DAW and trying to keep track of all the BRM settings from song to song, and maybe different trims and down mix, especially if the songs were mixed by different people. Can you talk a little bit about how the assembler helps with that part of it?
You have to make sure the transitions between songs feel correct on an album. And since the length is usually determined by the stereo, since the stereo is normally done first, you have to then adjust your fade to make that work, in the Atmos mix or master. So you get that spacing set up, and once if you're doing those fades in Pro Tools or Nuendo, which we usually do, you get it into the assembler and you might realize, oh, I've got to shorten this. Or the only real trick you get into is when uh, the immersive mix doesn't have as long of a tail as the stereo. And then you can't really control that gap. Sometimes you have just too long a gap. There's not much you can do about it. Or if it just fades down too quickly. And that's definitely happened to us as well. Or one major issue is maybe they've VSO'd or time modulated the stereo mix. And we've run this a couple times, and sometimes the solution is because the immersive mix is already done, they just opt to not VSO the immersive mix. Well, okay, now it's a slightly different length. So now sometimes with you have to manipulate fades to make that work.
Right. And what about when there's songs with different binaural render mode settings? Talk about how hard that was in a DAW.
Oh yeah, that's huge. Like that's why, like I say, I couldn't even do this without the assembler. So if you just want to hear a transition between one song and the other, particularly if it's different, mix engineers, they're going to definitely have almost definitely have different binaural settings. But even the same mix engineer will choose different settings per song, or objects will live in different places. And honestly, I do think that you could successfully master a project completely in the assembler. We've just thus far tried to really emulate our stereo workflow, which is doing all the processing on one system, and then, with the exception of a minor tweak, um, uh, using the destination computer simply for assembly. So it's kind of funny that really it's designed kind of the way that we use even in the stereo world, an assembly computer.
When you're mastering, how frequently are you toggling back and forth between speakers and headphones, and what percentage of your time are you spending in speakers versus headphones?
It's funny. This is something that's constantly evolving. I mean, obviously, we're all learning here, and we've been involved in this for, gosh, about a year now, and we're still evolving our workflows. But I've often started with setting up a binaural listen and comparing that, referencing that against the stereo, because, like I said, normally this stuff that's, at least at this stage, is being reworked from stereo on either, even if it's a frontline thing, the stereo is completed before the Atmos is being started. So that gives me a good guide, and I can sort of just get my initial balances in place there. And then we'll translate that over to, like, if I do some edits or some level edits or something in there, we'll translate that over to the Pro Tools workstation, and then that'll be a good starting point. That's another place that the assembler has really opened some doors. Is now you can potentially do that in the assembler, and you can just line up those stereo files and go back and forth and get those initial levels, because that can cut your work time a little bit, since you've already leveled it for stereo. Okay, get it, fairly close. The issue that I've run into with this is different mix styles fold down to, I guess fold down is the wrong word, but translate into binaural and to Apple Spatial differently. And this is also, a major, this is a major problem in mastering. Like I think I talked about this earlier. Um, uh, one mix might sound, two mixes might sound the same level in speakers, and then you put them into a binaural setting and they don't. And so it's like how, if you start completely in the binaural world and you go based on that, well, your speaker is going to sound really messed up. So it can be a good starting point, but you really got to, it's important to go back and forth. And that's something that we may spend more time on than a mix engineer, because our emphasis is on translation and cohesiveness between tracks. And in some cases, you're no pun intended, limited in what you can do. But you try and you try and make it get as good as you can.
Yeah, it's a balancing act for sure. Luke, how about you? How much time are you spending on headphones versus speakers?
It's honestly probably about 50-50. I mean, like I said, I typically start on headphones as well, just to sort of get your bearings. But then when you flip over to speakers, things change so much, and making an EQ tweak on headphones to ease out some of the harshness that comes in that fold down, frequently takes some of that sparkle away from the speakers, and just things like that. So you really do have to sort of flip between them constantly in order to strike up a good balance.
Yeah. Okay, so last question for you guys is, there's a lot of new mix engineers coming into the Dolby Atmos format. What advice would you give to a new mix engineer who's about to deliver a project for mastering? What are some of the common pitfalls that you see and some of the phone calls that you frequently have?
Well, one thing I would certainly uh, say is keep an eye out for what I talked about in terms of something, uh, 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 s- an instrument or an object being there in, or this could happen in the bed too, but being there in speakers and not being there in various binaural formats, or not sitting the way you want to sit. That's definitely a biggie. Gosh, I'm a little caught off guard with that one because I feel like there's a lot of those, and I'm blanking on them right now. Do you have any?
That's all right. I bet Luke has some.
Yeah, if removing of empty objects on the mix stage is definitely handy. I mean, it's fine. We can take them out, but might as well just remove them on the mix side. Labeling objects and things is
that's very
also
helpful.
not necessary, but super handy. Like if we're trying to isolate, if the vocal is in an object and we're trying to do something with the vocal balance, it's labeled right there. We can jump to it.
That's a huge time saver because we do spend a lot of time if we're trying to find that. Um, you just spend so much time, muting and soloing stuff, especially if something has a lot of objects. And then sometimes you have the vocal and then the vocal verb and the vocal effect, and they're all in different objects, and you don't want to miss any of that. That is one advantage, is that in the stereo world, you'll also often receive vocal up mixes, vocal down mixes, or guitar up. If you have a mix that is where the vocal is in its own object, I'm not necessarily recommending that for this reason, but if that is the case anyway, you actually have that kind of play where you can, okay, I can lower the vocal for this verse if it's just sticking out too much. And it's a lot easier to do that if you can find it.
I bet it is. Well, guys, thank you so much for being here, Luke and Andrew. Next up, I think we're going to take some questions that are coming in via the internet. But before we do that, I wanted to say, if you want to learn more about Georgetown Masters, you can go to georgetownmasters.com. And again, to find the album assembler, you can go to customer.dolby.com to download the free 90-day trial.
All right. So there on the screen is the QR code for the 90-day trial of the Dolby Atmos Album Assembler. And we will just wait a moment here for Jordan, Andrew, and Luke to join us back on screen. And we will dive into some questions. Thank you for all of the questions that have been submitted already. And you can continue to do so in the questions box here or at musicwebinars@dolby.com. A lot of feature questions for you, Jordan, and many best practices and workflow questions for Andrew and Luke. So we'll dive into them, and starting with one for you, Jordan. Can the Dolby Atmos Album Assembler be used to master TV shows for streaming?
Good question. So, the Album Assembler, being a music-focused tool, treats all the ADM files that we import as 24 frames per second. So for that reason, it's probably not the best tool for post-production because you're going to be getting, a lot of different frame rates coming in. So I would recommend using the Dolby Atmos conversion tool for any kind of quick edits and conversions that you want to use, that you want to do. And then, of course, your DAW for the rest of what you're doing. For everybody who doesn't use the Dolby Atmos conversion tool, it's a free tool that's available at customer.dolby.com. So I would suggest grabbing that.
Great, thanks. For Andrew and Luke, and some of these questions that are coming in, we've kind of touched on a little bit, but for you gentlemen, how often are you asked to make revisions after the customer hears their mixes for the first time?
Not that frequently. We try to involve the mix engineer and the producer or whoever the point person is from the get. If we have questions, we'll definitely reach out to them. We do have some producers that will come by the studio and they'll listen here and we'll work through any options, and that's what's nice because of our setup. They can actually easily hear before and after. They can hear things compared to the stereo very easily, whereas some producers don't even have the environment to listen properly at this point. So it does happen, but it doesn't happen all that often. And I'd say when it does happen, it actually tends to be more from the mix engineer than from the final client. Some experience.
That's been my experience too.
Great, thanks. A lot of questions about time code, Jordan, for you. Kind of put them together here into one. Does the album assembler export new time code for each song in an album? And does time code remain relevant once the final master is exported?
Yeah, so when we were designing this, we thought about most people who are going to be exporting mastered ADMs from the assembler are sending them directly to their streaming service or label for encoding. And the encoders that encode to Dolby Digital Plus JOC or Dolby AC4 are all ignoring any time code in those ADM files, and they're using other mechanisms to kind of align the songs that are all butt joined into an album. And so everything that the album assembler exports is at 0 time code, regardless of its position on the timeline. Definitely, we're hearing that there's some reasons why people want to, maintain the timeline time code, and those are some options that we can look into adding in the future, possibly.
Great. Quite a few questions on binaural settings for you, Jordan, and if Andrew and Luke want to chime in on these. Can I update binaural settings while working in the album assembler? 1, and then 2, can you export the binaural mixes from the album assembler once the ADM file is exported?
Yeah, the answer is no to both of those. So those can certainly be done in the renderer application, but in terms of the album assembler, you're pretty much just monitoring the binaural render mode settings that are already existing in the ADM file.
Well, that is definitely no.
So for Andrew and Luke, in terms of the layout of your studio and your multiple studios, do you use the same computer, room, and speakers to do your Dolby Atmos mastering as you do for your stereo mastering? I know you touched on that a little bit in the conversation, but the question did come up again.
Yeah, no, we actually have a separate room, but we did try and, we also we have the same near field monitors in both rooms, so there's a consistency there. And we did really make a huge effort to try and emulate our stereo workflow in the immersive room, but it is a dedicated room which works better for us for a lot of reasons.
Dedicated room and computers, but we do have audio lines connecting the two in case we want to just throw stuff in 2 different places at once.
Yeah, we're actually using totally different workstations for that matter than we're working in the stereo environment.
A question about soloing elements in the album assembler, Jordan, for you. Is it possible to actually solo elements while listening to the mix in the album assembler?
It is not at this time. You're monitoring through the renderer, and so you can use anything that the renderer has for your monitoring. For example, you could, select the objects only or the beds only button to do that, but there's no sort of solo functionality at this time.
Great. In terms of like your Andrew and Luke, kind of your go-to tracks for reference, are there any specific release tracks that you like to reference before starting to work on a new project, or some that maybe have more movement, or those that are more subtle? Any kind of favorite reference tunes?
Usually I tend to reference stuff we've done recently, because it feels like every project evolves, everyone's getting better. So the stuff that we're referencing now probably won't be what we're referencing next week. But we'll go on the Apple playlist for whatever that genre is that we're working in. Some of the Blake Shelton stuff that we've done, I've been really happy with how that's turned out. I'll reference that stuff.
No, I'm kind of the same way. I reference the Blake stuff a lot too, but it really does sort of depend on stuff that we've recently done.
And we spent a lot of time on those ones too, and then they did on the mix stage as well. Getting them where they need to be. So
plus we've done a lot of that in stereo, so it's
very helpful.
It's a very good bearings, artist.
That is one thing. It's a lot easier for me to work on an immersive master when I've worked on the stereo master as well, just because so much of it comes down to familiarity with the music, and you have that leg up if you've already familiar with it because you worked on the stereo. It can really get you started a little bit quicker.
Yeah, and I've actually used some of our Stereo Master settings in the Atmos world if they translate closely.
Follow-up question for Andrew and Luke. This is kind of on best practices and mixing. What are your thoughts on LFE usage? What are your recommendations for best practices? And I know that that's a very wide question that has a lot of dependencies on it, but if we could get your take.
I definitely would not. I mean, I've seen it done effectively in many ways, but I would not rely on it too much. I certainly would filter it lower than you. I mean, I think when you filter it down lower, like below, below 80 hertz, it helps a lot, especially in terms of translating to various binaural formats and whatnot. Yeah, when it goes up too high, it can really, there's all kinds of issues if you're not filtering it low enough. And the question is, do you really need it for music? I mean, that argument could be made both ways, but I mean, it's a low frequency effect channel. I mean, if you're doing effects in the music, is it necessary? Can you get that same low end extension out of bass management on your playback system? And I've heard a lot of mixes done very effectively that have no LFE or next to no LFE.
Jordan, a couple of questions about the algorithms that the limiter is based on and the EQ settings. Can you talk a little bit about how those were developed and some of the testing that was done?
Yeah, absolutely. So both of them are, using Dolby algorithms, and they're all applying the processing equally to every object embed channel in the ADM file. The limiter is pretty unique in that it's doing an Atmos render in real time under the hood, using that render to drive a sidechain signal that's then driving the limiter algorithm to apply to all the channels equally.
Follow-up question on the Album Assembler file format compatibility. Can the Album Assembler export MP4 files or any other file format?
Not at this time, but that's definitely something we could look at adding in the future.
For Andrew and Luke, is there a clear difference in the perception of sound pressure between a normal stereo mix and an immersive mix? Do you have any best practices in mind for regarding sound pressure of an immersive mix? Obviously, that's a very big question, but and there's a very perceivable difference, but yeah.
Yeah, and that also comes down to going into headphone, like the sound pressure level changes, on that same mix in headphones versus speakers, in terms of comparing to the stereo. I'm not, as far as the best practices on how to, I guess I'm not sure if they're talking about listening level, but I mean, in terms of listening level, I mean, I'm normally listening, I think our meter's reading around 85 dB when I'm in there.
Something like that.
But even in stereo, I'll often check things, quiet as well. I'm not sure I answered the question correctly, but I'm not sure I understood it correctly.
Yes, there's a perceivable difference, of course, in SPL levels.
That is definitely true, yes.
Jordan, for you, can you use this instead of the conversion tool, the Dolby Atmos conversion tool, to take a long ADM file and break that up into separate tracks?
That's a little challenging to do in the Album Assembler right now, so I would still recommend using the conversion tool for that because it has a dedicated split function. Yeah, in the Album Assembler, there's some workarounds you could do where you could trim a long file small and then re-import it again and trim it, but that would probably take more time than just using the conversion tool.
And a question on the stereo gain adjustment. Is it just for monitoring or does it render quieter?
It's just for monitoring. Yeah, it's just so that you can level match the stereo versus the Atmos when you're kind of A/Bing between them.
It's nice that you can actually just turn that knob on the fly. It's not a render situation.
Right.
So a couple of questions that are coming in about monitoring different streaming services. Andrew, you guys talked about it a little bit, but what are you using to kind of monitor the consumer experience on different services, and how do you go about that?
We have we have a preamp that will convert HDMI into, and we're not using it as a preamp. We're using it just as a conversion tool. They'll convert HDMI into AES67, and then AES67 into our Dante system, which we can then route using, routing software, and then it can essentially be selectable as a monitor input on our same preamp and D to A. And then we have a Echo Studio. We have a sound bar that all do Atmos. We can hear what that sounds like in those consumer environments, but I'm paid more attention to what does it sound like on that same system. I'm more curious, how does this other song sound like, and how does it sound like on the same system we're working on? And also, we're often comparing, okay, how does the song that we worked on, once it's released, how does it translate? Because there have been issues with translation there as well, where it's not playing back the way that's supposed to. Fortunately, some of those have been resolved over time.
Thanks. Jordan, you talked about this a little bit, but how does the album assembler today handle a gapless playback situation, and where is that heading?
Yes, good question. So, if you're doing crossfades, that obviously is not supported in the assembler yet. So you're going to be doing that in your DAW. So you can bring in, a full long play into the assembler and play it back. But then, of course, if you export that, it's going to be a long ADM. So probably best practice, and Andrew and Luke should speak to this too, is do your crossfades in your DAW. Split up the files, in the lengths that you want it, and export them from there, and then bring those kind of split ADMs with the crossfades baked into the assembler if you want to do that. Any other thoughts, guys?
Yeah, we have done that. Honestly, the simplest way that I discovered to do it is to set up the crossfade in Nuendo, actually, with the internal renderer. And that way, because that I've found is much closer with its in and out points, and you can actually get that seamless transition when you butt them up in the album assembler afterwards.
Yep, exactly.
Great, thanks. Question for the Georgetown guys. If we know we're sending our pieces to a mastering house, how much should we care about hitting the -18 meter perfectly?
You don't have to concern yourself as much with that. That's one of the nice things about if you're going through the mastering stage, then that's one of the things you don't have to worry about as much. That being said, same as advice as I would give in the stereo world, there's no advantage to leaving something for the mastering stage. You should make it sound as good as you possibly can. We're here to catch anything you missed and possibly enhance something that you didn't think to enhance, or just bring a new perspective to it. But I would certainly try to complete things. I just wouldn't sweat, how, as long as you're not, grossly out of whack, sweat like exactly how are your readings, because that's something that we can handle. I will say it's difficult to do the same heavy lifting in immersive as it is in stereo. You can't do the same kind of heavy lifting. So in terms of compression and how far you push things without a lot more potential problems arising. So I definitely would try to, and when you're mixing and you're trying to match stereo, I'd always mix to try and match the stereo master as opposed to the stereo mix. That tends to work out a lot better, just because sometimes it's a lot more difficult to get there. Now, we have had times where, like Luke alluded to, where the same stereo, same mix engineer is doing the stereo and the immersive, and we can sometimes carry over some of our stereo settings if they did match to their stereo mix. But usually it makes our job a lot easier if you get it as close as you can possibly get it and let us sort of take it from there. Out of that.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we don't want people to disrupt their musical vision for the sake of us. We want you to create exactly what you want, and we'll take it and do our best to make it sound as good as it possibly can.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, we've got time for one or two more here. Jordan, is the assembler limiter being applied 100% equally to all objects?
Yeah, all objects and bed channels.
Okay, and are there any plans for the assembler to support third-party plugin in the future, plugin inserts in the future?
No immediate plans. We definitely see, how that would be cool. It's not an easy lift given kind of the way that Atmos works and kind of what I talked about with the limiter architecture. Just to say, open it up to like all VST plugins and expect that they would work, as we'd all want them to. But yeah, definitely something we can consider for the future.
Great, thanks. And with that, we're bringing this Dolby Atmos Music Community session to a close. Huge thanks to Andrew Mendelsohn and Luke Armentrout from Georgetown Masters for joining us and sharing their wisdom and knowledge. Thank you, guys.
Thanks,
Jordan,
guys.
thank you. Do you want to let folks know one more time where they can grab the album assembler?
Yeah, customer.dolby.com. There's a free 90-day trial, and if you want to purchase it, it's available on the Avid store.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And any comments or questions can be sent to musicwebinars@dolby.com. Thank you very much.